not really Napoleonic. But mostly especially the character, the drawbacks and the characteristic flaws of Napoleon are usually perceived as something typically French. I think it's the mistake to think that what's Napoleonic is also French. I would say that it's very that Napoleon is far from being a typical French, not only because he was Corsican, but also because he was not fastidious. He was very pragmatic, brutish, and so on. The French are usually more fastidious, and so on. They try to be more rational, and Napoleon was very rash and abrupt in his decision-making process. Not very French again. The French are considered as fastidious. It's a characteristic that was mentioned as something controversial, not negative, not positive. The travelers from the 18th century Britain, when they were traveling to the 18th century France, they have perceived that the Frenchmen had this tendency of picking and choosing for every salad plate and so on, from every plate with the food and so on, and they were just feeding themselves, but they were not eating like one dish, but trying something for this dish and that dish and that dish, what was making the British travelers furious, because it was such fastidious and not very nice and so on. So it was perceived. But the French think it's natural. Maybe it's because in French nation the southern customs and the northern customs combine. So it's the British always assume that the French would behave in some very specific way, but sometimes they are just much more southern than expected. The French are perceived as the nations of the amour toujours and so on, not so much about the nation of the war. I have mentioned already this phenomenon when I was talking about the stereotypes about the Germans, but it's mostly because Paris was preserved through the World War II without any serious damage, which is not the case of London, Warsaw or Berlin or many other cities. And so maybe it's because of that from all the nations, dominant nations of Europe, the French are the only one which have still intact 19th century architecture in the most of your city. So it's of course romantic and sentimental, and this value cannot be this difference cannot be stressed enough. And I think it's because the World War II also has showed that although the French have were invading for centuries different nations and many nations, and they have invented many words like siège, infanterie, and arrière-garde, avant-garde, and so on, and most of the military vocabulary. But after this war, when it was clear that they are not invincible, they were tended to accept their new identity as the amour toujours nation, because the Paris, the 19th century Paris was there, and so on and so on. The Austrians have a very similar approach with the romanticization of Vienna and the walls and so on, and the Austrians are no longer empire after the World War I, so it's very similar. Although the French are still regional superpower, so there's the difference, but the Austrians had no chance of being that. But when it comes to, I said about this difference between the capital cities of of Germany and of France and of Britain, so it's a clear difference here. The ballet, the French have invented the French culture was very decentralized in the 17th